Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So we have all, I'm sure you as I have noticed inflation just being crazy lately, and we're not the only ones. So are the broadband operators, the ISPs that bid on RDOF 2 years ago. Be right back. Thanks for joining me, Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. I want to make sure that I covered this story because it is a big deal. Like I say, we're all experiencing it just in our everyday lives. You come back from the grocery store and you're like, wow, things have really gone up in price. The thing that made it real for me was Costco chocolate chip cookies because they went up $1 and then they went up another $1. So I'm like, wow, it's hitting home for me right now because a lot of times I do the Costco shopping and I was never leaving there without a box of chocolate chip cookies, but I've cut back on that because of the price increase. So you see here, ISPs, inflation has doubled RDOF build costs. This is in Fierce Telecom. So I do want to read through this article, maybe comment on it. See here, inflation is wreaking havoc on several operators. Rural build plans, making financially tough projects even tougher. Financially tough from the perspective that these were already expensive areas, but that was the whole point of RDOF, was to be able to give these providers the opportunity to bid on how much support they would be willing to accept so that they could then make a case for deploying broadband in some of these hard to reach areas that ordinarily they would probably not touch. So the RDOF auction, just a little background, was it was a reverse auction. It was held right around this time frame in 2020. I know that the winners were announced in December, and I think the auction was going on around in October maybe of 2020, and it was announced in December of 2020 who the winners were, those people that won their auctions. And basically it was where everybody, this was ISPs that were participating in this, and there were census blocks that the FCC made available that could be available for bidding. And then ISPs would bid in a reverse auction, meaning that they would start at a higher price in what they would be willing to accept. So for example, I might say, okay, we're willing to accept, I don't know, let's say 75% support for this area, meaning that they would pay 25% and the government would pay 75% and they would deploy. And then there'd be several people bidding, and then somebody else might say, well, I'll accept 70%, I'll accept 60%. So through this reverse auction, then eventually there's a winner that basically it was the service provider that would accept the least amount of money from the government to build that out. And there were various categories. Most people bid in the gigabit category because the weighting favored them, in the sense that if the auction progressed, if it was not a really, really, really expensive area and the auction progressed to a certain point, then gigabit was going to win. But maybe in a really high cost area where not a lot of people were bidding, another technology might have won, like satellite or fixed wireless. And we know now that Starlink was never approved. They were a winner. They actually had won, according to the announcement in December of 2020, that Starlink had won a lot of different areas. They're one of the top winners, but the FCC eventually decided that they were going to not allow for that, so they did not win anything in the end. But that was an example of somebody that was bidding not in the gigabit category. But even when all of the winners were announced, 85% of those that bid were gigabit. So if you take Starlink out of that, then that was even higher, that most that were bidding were gigabit. So that's the way it worked. And everybody was committing based on what they thought it would cost to deploy broadband in that area. And over time, inflation had been fairly steady. There had not been a big increase in inflation, but in the last year, really year and a half, 2 years really, inflation just immediately spiked. So it's been, I think, year over year, it's been about 8% or so. And that's just something that these guys have to live with. So how does it double if inflation is 8%? We'll see what they're saying in here. So you can see here a number of operators with RDOF commitments told Fierce, this is Fierce Telecom, the cost of estimates for their bills have skyrocketed. Some are finding it difficult to find banks willing to lend them the money needed to complete their projects. So that's important because these guys are going to get this money over 10 years. So it's not like the government, if they win, the government then gives them all of this money. So it's spread out over 10 years, and they've got to come up with the money, whether that's through financing or whatever, to be able to build this out. And then over 10 years, they get 1/10 of that money every year for 10 years. That means those ISPs without a hefty amount of cash on hand could be at risk of defaulting on their obligations. Fierce conducted a series of email interviews with Joseph McGrath, owner of Texas-based fixed wireless provider TechWave, Nextlink CEO Bill Baker, and Plains Internet COO Andrew Monroe. Now, Nextlink was one of the top winners as well. Two of the three, McGrath and Monroe, told Fierce the estimated build costs for their RDOF projects have doubled since they were originally calculated, while Baker said costs have risen materially. In the case of Plains Internet, that meant a jump from an estimated $500,000 to $1 million as far as, I guess, their portion of this. So that's significant, obviously. For context, Plains Internet won $345,000 in the RDOF auction to cover 250 locations. That was in Kansas, Texas, and Wyoming. Nextlink got almost $430 million to cover 206,136 locations. So you can see the number of locations they're covering. And that's going to be depending on how many locations there were in a census block that was bid. That's in 12 states. TechWave bid as part of the Next Tier Consortium, which won $126.3 million to cover 80,000 locations in 14 states. That TechWave's portion totaled $372,240 to build 5,886 locations in Texas. All three offer a mix of fiber and fixed wireless service. So that could be some of what's going on here, in that these guys, when they were bidding, they might have been thinking that they were going to do more of their territory as fixed wireless, but maybe the realities have set in that, if we're going to hit this gigabit tier that we bid in, we're just going to have to be putting more fiber in the ground. So that's not necessarily from inflation. I'm thinking that's got to be part of it, because for something to double when you've got 8% roughly, again, year over year, the last year to this year, 8-point-something% inflation rate difference between today and back then. So maybe that's why this is a double instead of 8, 10, 12% or something like that. The other thing is, in addition to that, there's some of these folks may be making a decision to go with a different kind of PON technology. Maybe they bid GPON, and a lot of folks now, when they're looking at fiber, are putting in XGS PON, 10 gig PON, because of the fact that that kind of future-proofs you more. And if you can get cards today that will do XGS PON and GPON. So if you're going to be getting fiber cards, you'd want to be getting the XGS PON cards, which are going to be a little bit more expensive. Prices are coming down on those, but that's going to be more expensive than maybe what you were looking at on just GPON a couple of years ago. Plus, there's the added inflation on top of that. So even though the prices are coming down, maybe that's being that's being affected or impacted, not coming down as much due to inflation. So you see here, Baker and McGrath. Oops, where'd it go? Baker and McGrath attributed the change to inflation, which is pushing the cost of things like labor, materials, and fuel skyward. And there's no doubt about that. As prices go up, let's start with fuel. Okay, so the prices of gas went up, and that, some of that has to do with the Ukraine, but really the prices of gas were going up before the war in Ukraine. It just started going up. This administration has been a little less friendly toward the oil companies, so there's going to be less investment in oil when the administration's not friendly to oil companies. So I think that's a big part of it. Then plus the Ukraine war, you've got that. So when fuel prices go up, that impacts everything. That impacts the price you pay for food. It impacts everything, because everything's it impacts the cost for plastics and stuff like that that's made with oil. So when those things go up, when fuel goes up, that drives the price of food, and everything gets transported with fuel, trucks, and those kinds of things. That is going to impact the cost of living for everyone. That's going to impact how much companies are willing to pay for employees. We have on top of that the fact that employees were just looking for people. I mean, fast food places, everybody was looking for a $15 minimum wage, and they were trying to force that. And now we have that almost. We have that just due to the fact of supply and demand, which is the way capitalism works, right? So there were fewer people in the market because of the pandemic, and people weren't coming back to work so soon because the government was paying a lot of people money to stay home. So people were not coming back to work, or for other reasons they were, they weren't looking that hard, but there were the jobs out there. People weren't taking the jobs, so that was driving up the cost of wages. And of course, when you drive up the cost of wages, that drives up the cost of the stuff that you buy, because the businesses are paying people more. So you're paying a fast food worker $15 an hour, which is going to mean that they have less profit margin, which means they have to raise the price of your hamburgers or your chicken sandwiches or whatever. And it's the same for broadband. So, broadband operators, their costs have gone up. The cost of truck rolls have gone up because of the cost of fuel. The cost of all of the materials that people have to buy have gone up, again, because the people making them or fabricating them, their wages have gone up, the cost of materials have gone up. All of this stuff is driving inflation. So it's this vicious cycle that we're dealing with right now. And one thing about inflation is it doesn't go away. It's basically here forever because once the inflation is there, you generally don't get deflation. So if we're 8%, 10% over what we were last year, that's the starting point. So if next month the inflation rate hasn't risen, that doesn't mean we're at 0% inflation. That means that we're still 8% higher than we were last year. So in other words, we're at that base, and then hopefully the rate of inflation slows back to where it was, to where it's like 1 point something, 2%, something like that, and then it's a little bit easier for people to handle. So it says there's a small argument made about some technology being introduced post-bid that we'd rather install than what we'd originally planned that comes with a higher price tag. That's negligible enough of a difference to actually count, in my opinion. That's what Monroe said. But I think some of that, again, is maybe people deploying more fiber than they were planning on originally, or, again, looking at maybe XGS-PON instead of GPON. It's harder to say whether the worst is past. Baker said he believes the biggest cost impacts have mostly rolled through the system at this point. And again, hopefully inflation is slowing down. If it does, because the Fed's taking a lot of actions to do that, price for money has gone down, or has gone up, quite a bit. Of course, that impacts these guys. But that will hopefully start to control inflation again, where even though we've had this inflation increase, and there's not a lot we can do about that. If the amount that it increases in the coming months decreases, that will help. It won't get worse, a lot worse. It's hard to say whether the worst is past. Baker said he believes the biggest cost impacts have mostly rolled through the system. I read that, sorry. One thing seems certain, though, costs likely aren't going to go back down anytime soon, as I said. And for ISPs without a piggy bank, that means they'll need bigger loans to cover the higher costs of their builds. As it turns out, that's easier said than done, even for government-backed projects. If we had to point to a singular concern, it would be having enough capital to buy enough equipment far enough in advance. We traditionally have bootstrapped on customer growth to generate more customer growth. Having to order equipment a year in advance and sit on the loss of income is tough and could make things difficult if it gets any worse, Monroe said. And you would order equipment in advance for two reasons. One is supply chain issues. It's just been hard to get equipment. It's been hard to get fiber. For a while there, fiber was a year out. If you ordered it today, it would take a year to get it. There's that. Plus the fact that, again, if you're seeing inflation go up at the rate that it's going up, you want to get something on order so that you kind of lock your price in, so that the price doesn't go up. If you order it, let's say, 6 months, a year from now, it could be a lot higher. Because a lot of the stuff, well, I was thinking beads, so RDOF money is being released and people are having to get that now. It continued day to day, though. We're fairly confident we'll finish. With that said, we still struggle to get loans to build out anything. At this point, it's comical how many refusals we get for loans relating to our business. Now, if you think about the loans, again, the price of money has gone up because of the fact that the Fed is tightening up things, then interest rates are going up. So even if you can get a loan, your interest rate is going to be higher, which means it's going to be costing you more. So that's a problem as well. McGrath seconded this point, noting conversations with other ISPs have revealed a lot of concern about finding additional funding to complete their RDOF builds. He argued the U.S. government should consider extending its broadband load programs to include RDOF winners in order to ensure ISPs can meet their commitments. McGrath pointed to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Reconnect program as evidence that such loan arrangements work well for rural broadband projects. So that particular program, USDA Reconnect uses either 100% loans, 100% grants, or a combination of the two. Whereas again, what this was a reverse auction, so it's not a loan. It's not something that's, they can take out a loan from a bank to get help with the portion that they have to pay, but basically the government is going to fund the rest of that based on what they bid in the auction. And by the way, this money, unlike something like RDOF or the BEAD program, the Infrastructure Act, this is not coming from tax dollars. So the RDOF program comes from the FCC, and that comes from USAC, which is the USF program. So that's the money that's collected on your phone bill. When you get a phone bill, it says USF fee. I don't even know how much it is these days. It keeps going up, but that's where that money is coming from. To be clear, this is not a grant. This is a loan that that the ISP has to repay, well, I'm not sure what he means there. So the ISPs don't have to repay the RDOF funds that they get from the government. But if they take a loan from a bank, yeah, they have to repay that. So that must be what he's saying. So this is not a loan this is a loan that the ISP has to repay, but under more favorable terms since it's providing for the public good, McGrath said. Maybe he's kind of, oh, he's probably comparing that to what USDA does. If ISPs struggle finding supplemental funding, it increases the potential risk of defaults occurring, thus slowing down the deployment of internet access to those areas that the FCC deems lacking and those people struggling to get internet access. Absent some sort of help, Baker predicted poorly funded or overly leveraged operators will face severe problems in the current inflationary environment. He pointed out rising interest rates are impacting the cost of debt, and many new funding programs require letters of credit from banks. So I know that's something that's in the BEAD program, for example, that requires a letter of credit. Although I did see a story the other day where I think some WISPs had convinced them that they could bypass that letter of credit because it was very expensive for them to get that. So maybe that's something that could be looked at here. I would not be surprised to see the industry entering a period of consolidation beginning in 2023, he concluded. But Conexon partner Jonathan Chambers had little sympathy for the concerns expressed by the other three. He argued RDOF was never designed to cover construction costs. Instead, it was simply meant to bridge the shortfall between the expense and revenue associated with rural deployments. And he's right there in the fact that ISPs deploy broadband and they generally cover the full cost of that. And the reason they were not building out in rural areas was because the cost was so much higher. And the return, frankly, is less because you have fewer customers per mile. So you're getting less per mile of everything. And as far as managing that network, you're getting less revenue from those customers to be able to help defray the cost of managing. So it's a lot more expensive. So in a sense, he's correct. Chambers pointed out that the calculation the FCC used to set reserve prices for census blocks in the auction, or that's how they calculated that. So the FCC looked at how much more expensive it would be to serve a rural area versus let's say, an average area, and that's kind of how they put that reserve in there. And if participants bid down those reserve prices down to a fraction of their original total, as many did, going down to 1% in some cases, and netted less support as a result, then that's their own fault. So in other words, if these people that were bidding down how much they would accept, and they really wanted to get this, but they bid it down so low that it wasn't going to be feasible for them to deploy this, then that's their own fault. Of course, again, probably not many of them were thinking about inflation being at the rate that it's been for the last year. Conexon's Rural Electric Cooperative Consortium walked away from the RDOF auction with $1.1 billion to build broadband to 1,618,000 locations across 22 states. So Conexon, they built their business based on helping electric membership co-ops get in the broadband business. So they've been doing that for several years. They're kind of used to that, building out fiber. They've been working with lots of different co-ops, so they've got some economies of scale doing that, and they've got some experience doing that, especially in these rural areas where that might have been less. A lot of these other providers may not be as experienced in the rural areas and everything that it takes, so they might have had a little advantage in knowledge there. So they're saying, he's saying if they think they can't make that work, they shouldn't be in business of taking public money and not being able to satisfy their public obligations. While Chambers acknowledged construction costs have a role in determining whether the FCC's subsidy calculation was sufficient or not, he said rising costs should have been factored into the operator's build estimates. He added Conexon has actively taken steps to mitigate cost increases, and thus far the cost increases it has seen have not outpaced its predictions. So maybe they were better about predicting that, or maybe because of all of their activity, they had a lot of stock on hand at lower prices, or they had deals in place maybe to get equipment and fiber at lower prices. That might have helped them. Or maybe they did. Maybe they were anticipating more inflation than the others. I don't know. According to the FCC, RDOF participants have already defaulted on obligations covering more than 265,000 census blocks. A total of nearly 787,000 eligible census blocks were included in the auction. Though some defaults have been caused by participants' failure to secure the required state certification necessary to receive federal funding, Starry notably backed out of all of its commitments to focus on financial resources elsewhere. So the reason for some of the defaults, a lot of them, like LTD Broadband, for example, LTD Broadband had a real problem getting the ETC designation, eligible telecommunications carrier, because in order to do RDOF, in addition to offering data service connection, you had to be able to offer voice service. So you needed to be qualified as an ETC, and you had to go through your public, the state's various public utility commissions in order to get that designation. You had to do that within a certain amount of time, and LTD Broadband and some others did not get that done in time and didn't show good faith. And so eventually the FCC completely eliminated LTD Broadband. One of the top winners, might have been the top winner, I think, and said they could not participate. So that was one example of that. Then you had Starlink, as I mentioned, who I think was able to get most of their ducks in a row as far as that, but the FCC came back and eventually had concerns about whether they'd be able to meet the speed requirements for the tier, and they did not bid in gigabit tier, they bid in 100 by 20. So that I think was the reason that they were told they would not win anything. And then you had another big winner, one of the top 10, Starry, backed out because they were in some financial issues, and I think put everything on top of that, including the cost of money now for them to be able to get loans. And they decided to retrench, and they did a big layoff, and now they're going to focus specifically on just the areas where they are. They're not going to be expanding. So they backed out of the RDOF auction. With more defaults looming, Chambers said it's partly the FCC's fault for not coming up with a more robust auction design. For instance, he noted the agency could have structured the auction such that the next bidder in line, in a given census block would receive support if the original winner defaulted. And that's been a question for everyone, including me, is what happens when these people default? And I'm of the opinion now that nothing happens. I think the FCC is going to just say, okay, we're done. They're not going to try to redo any of these defaulted areas. They're not going to do a phase 2 auction, because when RDOF occurred, there was no other money coming out other than what was already there. So there was the USDA stuff that was there, but ARPA was not there. That was the coronavirus plan, the American Rescue Plan Act, I think it was. And you had the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act come after that. So that was two huge bunches of money that came out after RDOF. So I think the FCC is now like, you know what, we're just going to wait and see what happens with all of this other money that's on the way. So I don't expect anything to happen with RDOF. But what he's saying here is, they could have just said, okay, if somebody defaults, then the next bidder up will get the opportunity then to complete that. He says, or could have given participants an easy out by offering a no penalty default window after the auction for those who bid beyond their means. The money could have then been redistributed through a rapid follow-up proceeding, he said. Although the problem with that is then you'd be encouraging people almost, to say, well, bid below your means, and then you can decide later if you want to do it. I don't know about that. But I think if somebody defaults, going to the next bidder would have made sense. But that didn't happen, and now because RDOF funded areas won't be eligible for support from the $42.5 billion BEAD program, Chambers warned there's a risk that late defaults could allow some unserved areas to slip through the cracks. I see what he's saying there, although it's not going to be until probably mid next year before the NTIA says, well, the final maps, let me think now. Okay, so there are challenge processes going on now, and then the final maps will come out in probably March, April of next year. The NTIA is going to make a decision based on those maps, but I'm sure, let's say in spring, the FCC is going to be making the final decision as to RDOF awards. So any defaults after that, I think they would have awarded everything, and I don't think there will be any defaults after that, at least hopefully not. Let's see, now that they've cleaned up a lot of it, sorry. But you tell me people are going to say, oh, we didn't know there was going to be cost increases. What can be done? Default, good, because the default at least clears it up. You conclude it. That could happen, but again, I think that would happen, I guess that's the end of the article. I think that would happen before the FCC makes the final maps. So, again, we're looking here, we're in October. I think the FCC has pretty much selected or authorized just about everybody. They haven't come out and said it's completely done. So there must be a few that are left, but all the top guys are either have been authorized or have said, we're not going to authorize you. So there are probably still some small ones out there. So I think any defaults are going to have to happen pretty quickly, because there are deadlines that people have to meet, and they're going to have to. I don't expect to see any defaults prior to let's say March, or I should say after maybe January of next year, February of next year. Let's see what we have here. So Ezra was watching one of my old episodes and the live stream popped up. Thanks, I appreciate that. Wow. Oh, forget the Fun Girls chat thing. Not sure why that's there. Can I delete that? I hate that. Let's get rid of that. Report that. And I think I got one more here. Let me report these live right now. There we go. Okay, so sorry about that showing up my screen there. I'm always terrified of Charter. This is Conway Fan 98 defaulting in my area. We are in desperate need of broadband. My 1 meg plan for Brightspeed with the ACP discount is ridiculous. Yeah, I get that. And hopefully, reporting one more here, sorry. Hopefully that will not happen with somebody like Charter. Charter's been pretty good about getting done what they need to get done. And they've been pretty good about deploying fiber in areas where they can. So being a larger provider like that and one that has money, hopefully you're in good shape. We'll just have to see. But anyway, I'm trying to help you be positive there. Hopefully that's going to be the case. So thanks for joining me, folks. I appreciate that. And again, we'll have to see what happens if there are any more RDOF defaults, or we'll have to see when the FCC finally says, hey, you know what, I'm really waiting for them to say, we're done. Okay, we're done with phase 1 of RDOF. And maybe at that point they'll say there'll be no additional RDOF awards anytime soon, or maybe there won't be any at all and there won't be a phase 2. We'll have to see what they say there. But once they're done there and everybody has been authorized, then there'll be several months before the final maps are done. So hopefully all the RDOF areas, all the places that have been authorized will be taken off of the map. And we'll have, as I did a broadcast the other day, hopefully we'll know that all of the areas that are unserved and underserved will be able to be covered by the BEAD money that's coming out. I did a broadcast last week sometime with something that the ACA did in cooperation with Cartesian, where they looked at nationally looked at all of the states and how much they expected each state to get. And they looked at the lay of the land and tried to scientifically guess how many areas were unserved and underserved in each area based on data that they had, and then adding on top of that 477 data, because they know that's not accurate. And they're saying that every state can reach almost every subscriber with fiber, and in some cases every state can reach every subscriber with fiber and still have money left over. So that's the good news. So we'll see how it goes. And Conway Fan 98, you will have gigabit broadband at some point, and I think it's going to be maybe next year. We'll have to see if Charter can get it out to you next year, but I think it's coming. So thanks for joining me. If you'd like the video, give me a like if you would, subscribe, click the little bell to be notified when I'm live, and you'll receive a notification on your browser or on your device. So thanks for joining me. Just like Ezra, something popped up there and saw that I was live, and they popped in there. So thanks, appreciate that, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.